The Coastal Housing Coalition is pleased to present the need for housing, the environmental, economic, and social benefits of local housing for local workers. The shortage of housing in Santa Barbara County's south coast has been a problem whose effects have been building for better than a decade. While the number of jobs in the south coast have been allowed to increase in the region over a long period, the required amount of housing has not kept pace. Planning professionals estimate that for every 1.5 jobs added to a community, 1 additional dwelling unit is needed to house new workers, and that simply hasn't happened. Instead, the growing South Coast has exported its housing responsibilities to neighboring and distant communities, while many choosing to live locally are forced to do so in crowded conditions. The question is, how much longer will the South Coast continue to export its housing responsibilities at the expense of other communities? The problems associated with the housing shortage are becoming difficult to ignore. Some of the more obvious ones are increasing congestion of streets and roads by commuters in single-occupant vehicles. Single-family neighborhoods are increasingly congested with parked cars of people living in homes and apartments not designed for multiple-family living. Communities beyond the South Coast are experiencing the reverse jobs housing imbalance. Too many residents who commute and too few jobs. Time and money spent commuting deprives communities of workers' volunteer times and robs families of time together, as well as the discretionary income spent supporting automobiles for commuting. And dollars earned on the South Coast are spent in other communities, significantly reducing the economic benefit of recycled dollars by local job holders. As we discuss the housing situation, it's helpful to understand what the terms affordable and workforce housing mean, since that's what we're going to be focused on. Affordable is legally defined as housing, either rental or ownership, available to people earning no more than 120% of area median income. It's also housing that requires public subsidies. In the South Coast, for a family of 4, 120% of AMI translates to about $80,000 a year. Workforce housing is not legally defined, but locally is considered to apply to those earning between 120 and 200% of AMI. The upper end of that range is approximately $130,000 a year, around what a 2-income family might make working as a teacher and a fire suppression professional. It will also help to understand how wide the income to housing price gap is in the South Coast, so we can better understand the challenge of providing housing to middle and lower income workers. This graph illustrates the annual salaries of selected individual workers and what level of house payment or rent they could qualify for. The second bar from the right shows our theoretical working couple who could qualify to buy a residence in the $500,000 range, if such could be found. And the bar at the far right represents the median selling price of a house in the South Coast in the summer of 2005. Buyers of such a residence would have to earn approximately $250,000 per year, well beyond the middle income range. Coastal Housing believes that the current debate on housing in the South Coast is missing several elements that we should not ignore. First, in a free society, safe and affordable housing is a basic need, but limiting its supply when there is an obvious demand makes it a commodity. We think we should be asking ourselves, is it healthy for people and for communities when we exclude a significant component who contribute to our economic vitality and well-being? By forcing local workers to live in other regions, not only are we causing a major component of our workday rush hour traffic congestion, but through the increased use of automobiles, we are also worsening air and water quality. Well, if the current trend continues, middle-income workers will become the endangered species of the South Coast, and we will become a region where there is little or no hope of ascending the economic ladder as a local resident. The real debate should be about the facts of population growth, which is occurring whether any of us likes it or not. Housing is not the cause of the problem, it's the effect. The fact that the South Coast, like California, is growing can't be disputed. Over the next 35 years, California will grow by an estimated 24 million residents, all of them deserving a safe, affordable shelter. 80% of that growth will be through births among people already living here, not immigration. No region in California will be immune or exempt from this growth, nor free from the responsibility to provide its fair share of housing. And that includes the South Coast, where jobs and population have grown over the last 10 or 20 years, but where housing has not kept pace, creating the current deficit. This deficit, amounting to more than 4,000 residences affordable to our local workforce, was not created by lack of demand, but by housing policies that have discouraged the building of middle-income housing. A healthy jobs-housing balance, as we've said before, is that for every 1.5 jobs created in a community, it should also be providing one new dwelling, and the South Coast has fallen far short of that. Obviously, a growing population requires newly built homes for its workforce, with the construction of apartments, condominiums, or single-family homes. But coastal housing believes that much of this need can and should be provided without continuing to sprawl into open spaces and farmlands. The old patterns of growth are wasteful of land and expensive to provide services to. If housing is to be affordable, it must be built more efficiently and more compactly. The planning policies and permit processes that have discouraged affordable and workforce housing in the South Coast need to change. But before we address the policies and processes, let's take a look at some of the economic impacts that the housing shortage has had on the South Coast employers in all sectors: business, industry, nonprofit, and government. As the cost of housing escalates, employers have more and more difficulty in recruiting the best qualified workers. Employers lose qualified, trained staff, leaving their jobs on the South Coast because they can't live where they would prefer and how they would prefer. The cost of training replacement staff increases, leading to bottom-line losses. And ultimately, businesses and industry will relocate to areas where housing is not crippling their ability to retain qualified staff. For those local employers not able to leave, the nonprofits and government, there are real questions about continuing quality of service if best qualified employees can't locate here. Listen to the stories of some South Coast workers and employers discussing how the regional housing crisis affects them, their families, their businesses, or the services they provide. These are people who serve us, who make our region a better place to live, and their stories are a warning that we need to hear and to heed.
As Executive Director of the Nonprofit Support Center, I'm concerned about the shortage of affordable and workforce housing. It makes it difficult for all nonprofits to recruit and retain good people. It may not seem urgent right now, but it is. Who's going to be left to work with our kids, to deal with our crises, to work with the fragile, or to bring music to our community? We all care about our community. Please support affordable and workforce housing.
I run a non-profit which feeds hungry people in Santa Barbara. We're one of the key designated emergency feeding facilities in event of disaster. As we discovered this past year, mud or fire can easily cut off Santa Barbara from the rest of the Central Coast. Santa Barbara is going to be in trouble if non-profits like mine are leaderless in times of greatest need. If people like me are barred from owning a home and having a stake in our community, what incentive is there to stay?
I've been a teacher here for 15 years. Before I had children, I could rent a room or a studio close to my students. Now, with a family, the closest home we could afford is an hour commute or more to my campus. As a third-generation Santa Barbaran, I feel a loss of community because I can't afford to live in the place I love and want to serve. I hope you support affordable workforce housing in our community.
One of the most troubling aspects of the shortage of housing affordable to working people is the uncertainty it introduces into our daily lives. There's a constant question as to whether or not our family can stay here. If we do have to move elsewhere to own our own home, I think it will be one more loss for the South Coast in terms of the diversity that healthy communities need.
I've worked at Cottage Hospital for 27 years. Of the 2,600 workers employed by Cottage Hospital, people who serve your healthcare needs, over 1,000 of us don't own homes here. Obviously, more workforce housing and affordable housing is needed here. At times it feels as though some people are saying, I've got mine, go somewhere else for yours. I hope people will give us a chance to be their neighbors and see how much pride we take in our share of the dream.
We have what other communities dream of, a world-class university committed to transferring technology to the community for commercialization. A highly educated, talented workforce capable of transforming that research into products and services to improve the lives of everyone in the world, and capital resources to fund this important work. What we don't have is housing. Our scientists and engineers can no longer afford to live here. Staff turnover at most companies in town is increasing at an alarming rate. Our technology community has kept Santa Barbara vital and strong for generations. This isn't just sad, it's the beginning of the end for a key component of our local economy.
I've been the police chief here for 5 years in Santa Barbara, and I can appreciate the need for workforce housing for public safety personnel here on the South Coast. I do not want to give the impression that my department or my personnel cannot respond to any emergency, but I do see my officers paying an increasing personal cost to them and their families with the long commutes, and I'm really concerned about how that's going to impact us in the future. We really need to build attainable workforce housing here on the South Coast, and I'm counting on you, the community, to help support that. Thank you.
So, who among us really wants to lose teachers, healthcare workers, public safety personnel, nonprofits on which we count to provide services no longer provided by government, and the chance to have our children stay in the area when they become working adults? Assuming that most people want all of the preceding, the workers and services that make communities and neighborhoods livable and desirable, why is there opposition to building the housing we need? Well, some fear that higher density housing brings urban problems and that building more compactly, more densely will result in high rises and slums. To answer this concern, we have to ask, what urban problems do the following local examples of well-designed and affordable workforce housing create? Because these represent some of the types of housing we need to encourage. Some believe that more housing will reduce their quality of living. And coastal housing believes that the greater threat to our quality of life is through maintaining current policies and permit processes which discourage and prevent the building of infill housing within our existing urban boundaries. Quality of life in the South Coast will surely continue to erode if we continue to sprawl in low-density suburbs, and if population continues to grow in existing neighborhoods not designed for it, such as occurs throughout the South Coast. Some believe that compact development will cause more traffic congestion. Compact development in existing urban areas close to public transportation and commercial services can actually reduce the congestion problems we're experiencing. A 2004 report by the Federal Transit Administration looked at several urban areas practicing what's known as transit-oriented development and found more recent research has confirmed that those living in compact transit-accessible locations tend to own fewer automobiles and log fewer vehicle miles traveled per year. A doubling of residential density was found to reduce household automobile ownership and vehicle miles traveled per capita in the 32 to 43% range. Well, reading some of the local papers, one might think there was an overwhelming public opposition to local housing for local workers, and some editorials are uniformly slanted against housing. But a recent survey by a credible South Coast grassroots organization, the Economic Community Project, shows otherwise. Based on this professionally developed survey of South Coast residents, a solid majority understand that the regional workforce and affordable housing shortage is at the root of our traffic congestion problems and the growing loss of middle-income workers. The ECP survey revealed that South Coast residents are much more sophisticated in their understanding of the consequences of the housing shortage than the local media gives them credit for. For example, by a 2-to-1 margin, South Coast residents support the creation of affordable housing, and they also support the need for price controls to maintain the supply of affordable housing. And also encouraging was the fact that a sizable majority of South Coast residents polled understand that building workforce and affordable housing will have no impact on the value of their own homes. Well, finally, the Coastal Housing Partnership's annual housing survey, conducted among several thousand South Coast employees, also reveals a growing interest among potential home buyers for condominium-type housing. CHP's survey shows a sharply increasing interest among workers currently living in rental housing in purchasing a condominium as their primary residence. In 1999, only 13% of those surveyed indicated interest in buying a condominium, but by 2004, interest in the condominium living had increased to 22% of the respondents. In other words, the potential market for compact development on the South Coast is increasing. But there's bad news, too, if we don't do something soon to increase the supply of South Coast workforce and affordable housing. Both the ECP and CHP surveys found that many in the local workforce who would like to live closer to their jobs are giving up hope of ever being able to live in the South Coast. The ECP survey shows that more than 2/3 of all workers at all levels of employment would leave the region if they cannot obtain decent housing. The Coastal Housing Partnership survey confirms the growing hopelessness among local workers looking to purchase a home in the South Coast. Local workers living in rental housing are increasingly considering leaving the region, and their numbers have risen from 56% of those surveyed in 1999 to nearly 66% in 2004. Some will say that we can never build any affordable or workforce housing in the South Coast, that land is simply too expensive now. There's no question that building affordable and workforce housing will be a challenge, given what middle and lower income workers can afford. But several in the business of providing homes here say they can build lower and middle income residences if local government would change their policies to encourage that level of housing. While no one does business to lose money, including home providers, there exists a strong sense of community welfare among many in the home building industry. Listen to the words of Mike Tobes, longtime and well-respected local philanthropist, financier, and home builder who came to Santa Barbara more than 40 years ago. Mr. Tobes cares as much as anyone about the quality of life here, but he also understands the need for housing. We begin by asking Mr. Tobes, can we build affordable and workforce housing on the South Coast, and what are the major barriers presently preventing us from doing so?
Well, I think there are things that we can do to provide workforce and affordable housing in this community. Of course, it's a challenge, and I don't think we're really going to solve the housing crisis that we have in this county, but I think there are a lot of things that can be done. One of the biggest problems is, for developers, is the uncertainty of the process. I think any developer you talk to would say the same thing. If the rules were more certain and they were followed, I think developers would be much more encouraged to provide housing in the community. I think there are a number of obstacles which have already been identified which could be removed by the legislative bodies if they chose to do that. As I say, I don't think we can solve the problem completely, but workforce and affordable housing is certainly something which can be provided in this county.
Next, we asked Mr. Tobes, what kind of people need affordable and workforce housing?
Well, I think that people have a misconception as to what kind of people make up the workforce and the affordable housing community. Median income in Santa Barbara County is about $65,000 a year. These are working people who hold down good jobs. The affordable housing that's been built in this community, I think, looks much better in many cases than neighborhoods which don't have any affordable housing in it. I think those people who live in those units take great pride in the fact that they've been able to accomplish home ownership, and I'm certainly proud of the affordable housing I've built in this community.
And finally, we asked Mr. Tobes what his concerns were for the future of the South Coast.
I'm very concerned about the future of the county, particularly the South Coast, because I think we're very rapidly driving the middle class out of Santa Barbara, and we will end up with a community which has some very wealthy people, retirees, and some lower income families who are doubling up and tripling up in housing. But the middle class is simply not going to live here in the future.
So, what are our choices? Well, doing nothing is a choice. We could maintain the status quo and continue to add limited market rate housing which exclude workforce and middle income families, or we can build local housing for local workers in existing urban areas closer to public transportation. Is doing nothing really a choice? As recent history has shown, population will continue to grow even without adequate, decent housing. The result of this benign neglect is overcrowded conditions of housing not designed for residents doubling or tripling up or more. Well, coastal housing believes in urban infill development, and we believe that we all share the responsibility for housing, and we believe that there's a growing demand for the sort of compact development which will help satisfy the need for local workforce housing without ruining paradise. What do we need to do? What needs to change? Well, we need new ordinances and policies to encourage infill housing. We need to remove the current barriers to workforce and affordable housing, and we need to develop an inclusive vision for the South Coast that will result in an improved jobs housing balance and opportunities for an increasingly diverse population. To achieve this goal, the tone and texture of our civic dialogue on housing needs to change, and we need people from all walks of life to join us in speaking up in support of changing those policies to encourage and produce affordable and workforce housing. And compassion and empathy for the living situations of those working to serve us need to become part of our conversation. So please join with us in our Voices for Housing campaign and help us to speak up for housing for local workers whenever the subject comes up, to testify at hearings to support local housing for local workers, to write your elected representatives to tell them that you support well-planned local housing for local workers, and to let us know if an organization you belong to would like to have a Coastal Housing Coalition presentation on housing. As we engage in this critical conversation about local housing for local workers, it will help if we all remember the lessons of ecology. Everything is linked to everything else. A lack of local housing for local workers impacts the environment we care so much about. A lack of housing creates significant social justice issues for low and middle income workers. And of course, as new jobs are created, new housing is required. And since everyone agrees that we can't completely remedy the lack of housing in the South Coast, we need to vastly improve the convenience and efficiency of our transportation systems. So give us a call and join with us in our Voices for Housing campaign. Your voice is needed if the South Coast of the future will be a thriving, vibrant, healthy place to live. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll join with us in support of local housing for local workers.